Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. It's no secret that the spread of the coronavirus has created major challenges for the Australian government and the healthcare system, and many medico-legal experts within the personal injury sector are now wondering what the nature of work will look like in the foreseeable future. Personal injury assessments are considered an essential service, but given the government requirements around social isolation, the responsible and safe course of action is now to limit face-to-face interactions unless absolutely necessary, and that means undertaking assessments via video conferencing. Now, of course, video conferencing has been around in Australia for many, many years, but its adoption among specialists has been quite low, less than 1%, which means the vast majority of Australian medico-legal experts are now wondering how to quickly transition to telehealth, what strategies others are using to help them make their determinations in the absence of the physical laying on of hands, and indeed whether an impairment assessment can even feasibly and reliably be undertaken without a physical face-to-face assessment. All of these questions are extremely valid, and from the outset I'd like to express the opinion of myself and the panel, and that is that face-to-face consultations are indeed the gold standard. But the world has changed, and over the last 2 weeks, while it's no doubt there are limitations associated with video conferenced assessments, it's now time to look at what can be done via video conferencing and how it can be done, rather than all the reasons why it may not work. The personal injury sector isn't stopping. It simply can't afford to pause or halt for the next 6 months until we all get through this. And medico-legal assessments will continue on regardless. So tonight is about recognising that this is the new normal for most medico-legal experts, that this is new, and it's about sharing the wealth of ideas and learning from each other. And to get you started, I'd like you to consider these 2 quotes. The first is, every adversity brings with it the seed of an equivalent advantage. And the second is, the day you plant the seed is not the day you eat the fruit. We are really at the seed stage right now. But over the next 6 months, the personal injury sector will become so much stronger in its expertise in delivering video conferenced assessments. And I'm really quite excited to see what the new levels that can be achieved throughout all this adversity across the sector. Now, to help plant and water those seeds tonight, I have a wonderful panel who are going to share their experiences and perspectives on making the transition to telehealth. Let me introduce them to you now. Firstly, we have Dr. Greg Cameron, Occupational Medicine Practitioner, IMC and Chief Medical Officer here at MEDirect. We have Dr. Todd Gotthelf, Orthopaedic Surgeon here in New South Wales. We have Ms. Karena Nicholls, Partner at Coutts Solicitors, who has more than 15 years experience and knowledge in all areas of injury compensation and employment law. We have Dr. Ralph Poppenbeek, Occupational Physician from Victoria. We have Dr. Richa Rastogi, Psychiatrist here in New South Wales. And we have Dr. David Vivian, Musculoskeletal Physician with a special interest in pain. Now, I just wanted I just wanted to give you a little bit of heads up on tonight. We've had a lot of questions that have been submitted prior to tonight's webinar. The webinar may go a little bit over, possibly for an extra half an hour to 7:30, but if you do need to leave, please feel free to go. We just wanted to extend it so that we were able to answer your pressing questions adequately rather than cut them short. So tonight, what we're going to be covering is the current expectations from the regulators, the tribunals and the courts. We'll be looking at how to set a video conferencing assessment up for success. We'll be looking at how to conduct examinations via video conferencing, particularly when you're not in the same room with them. How do you do it? And answering the question, can impairment assessments really be done and can they be relied upon? I know that there are a lot of you in the audience here tonight who have asked that question, and we want to shed a little bit of light on that and share the perspective and experiences of our panel members. We'll be looking at security and video conferencing platforms, and then right at the end, we're going to be looking at some other initiative and resources that can help you beyond this webinar. Now, we would love you to ask questions as we go through. So on the screen, what you'll see is the control panel. I'd like you just to find the little grey menu bar that says questions. There's a triangle there which you can click on, and this will open the questions box. And from there, you'll be able to type any questions in the box. We'll be tracking for these questions as we go through, and at various points throughout the evening, we'll be putting the questions back to our panelists. Okay, so let's get straight into it. There is a lot of uncertainty now about what is expected of medico-legal experts in the current environment. So it's really important to understand what are the instructions that the regulators, the tribunals and the courts currently giving. So Karena, I'd like to ask you first, throw to you first, then followed by David, and ask you what messages are being communicated by CIRA, iCare, Comcare and the courts.
Hi, Sue. Basically, what's happening is the courts have suggested that we continue engaging in litigation and continue in bringing the matters before the courts and tribunals, even though it is a bit of a change in terms of how we do things. They will be accommodating it via telephone. They're creating virtual courts as we speak so that we can all continue to move the matters along and not create a huge backlog.
Okay, great. So the message from your end is very much we need to keep going. We need to find ways of progressing these claims.
Yes, we've actually got a direction from the Workers' Compensation Commission president, who has said that we need to be adaptive and creative. So we need to make sure that even though this is a challenging time for everybody, the injured workers or injured people are still getting the justice that they deserve and that their cases are still being progressed.
Okay, and I would also recommend to everybody who's online, you know, the regulators like CIRA, I know there was a notification that came out today, TAC, VWA are all, it's very much a work in progress right now, and I know that over the last day or so, many of them have been putting out announcements to provide some guidance around expectations for you as medico-legal assessors. So I'd really encourage you to for the different sectors that you work in and the different schemes to constantly check in on the websites for the regulators to find out what the current situation is recommending that you do. David, I know that since the world has changed over the last 2 weeks, you've certainly still been doing a lot of assessments in Victoria, and I wondered whether you could share your insights into what is the message that you're receiving in terms of the work that you're being provided with.
There's plenty of work there, and we have to get into telehealth, or we'll find some mechanism for doing so. As Sue said initially, opportunities change when adversity happens. It's a whole new ball game, and we have to be adaptive and ready to go. And it isn't easy day one, and it isn't easy necessarily day 4 when a problem arises. So you've got a problem solve on the run when you're doing this. And when I've talked to the claims agents or whoever's sent me work, they just want us to be pragmatic and get it done.
Yeah, absolutely, and it is about being flexible, David. I know that you've done a lot, very much over the last few weeks via video conferencing, and I think the message that you've certainly been feeding back is that it's about finding what's going to work now for you. It's about trying different approaches and finding out what's going to work. So thank you for that. Richa, I'm going to direct the next question to you. So I'm just going to pop your microphone on. And that question is really around, you are probably the most experienced person on this panel tonight, having conducted medico-legal assessments for many years as a psychiatrist. And over that time, you would have learned a lot about what does and doesn't work and how to ensure that you're getting the best possible outcomes from the consultation. So I'd love to hear from you, and our participants would love to hear about what advice would you give to other medico-legal experts, firstly about making the transition to telehealth.
As David said, this is the new era we're getting into. there are a couple of things I'd like to say is practice, practice, practice. Start using whatever platform you use with friends and family to get familiar with how it works. And once it works, it's not all that challenging or difficult. So I would say start getting familiar with whatever platform you're using, be familiar with your software, and things do work out very well.
Okay, so become familiar with it, and I think this is the point that we'll be talking about a little bit later as well, that, you know, I know certainly the message has been loud and clear when I have spoken to the regulators on occasion, and that is that if you are going to use technology that you know how to use and that's familiar, so that you are still in control of the consultation and getting the best outcomes from a clinical perspective, rather than having the tech get in the way. So, Richa, where you said practice, 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 you know, grab your grandkids, grab your children and practice and line them up and see what's going to work, see where all the controls are, so that when you're actually in the face-to-face, in the virtual consult with the examinee, you're feeling really comfortable with all the different things that can happen. And I guess that's probably the other message that we'll talk about a bit later on. All kinds of things will happen. It's about your ability to remain calm and to know what the technology will and won't do and what next to do best. So, Richa, in terms of the actual consultation, as a psychiatrist, I know there are quite a lot of psychiatrists that are here on the line. I'd like to ask you firstly, what differences do you notice between conducting your psych assessments face-to-face versus doing it via video conference? And what are some practical things that you do via video conference assessments that help you make an informed decision and help to provide you with some clarity and confidence in the recommendations that you make via video conference?
Certainly face-to-face consultations are always preferred in psychiatry. However, coming now to this virtual platform, there are two important things I would like to emphasize. One is the environment of the psychiatrist and the client, and second is having basically your software, and the environment is very important. So a couple of things I'd like to just highlight as far as my experience goes. One is you need to be in a very quiet, lighted room. You need to put a do not disturb sign. You cannot have a lot of noises in the background, because a psychiatric assessment is all about mental state and observation. So that's very, very important. And so the same applies for the client. What we do is a couple of days before we start, we do the consultation. We do send a written information to the client, what is expected, that they're familiar with their software, their camera is right, things about the environment. These are very important things to be educated to the client. And that actually helps. We also get the client to get their Skype ID set up. I use Skype mainly, and that actually helps. And also informed consent, what the session might entail. The most important thing is it's always important to have a backup plan. As you know, with technology, we just can't rely sometimes on your your internet. So I always keep a phone as a backup in case we need to use that, because in case, and it has happened at many times that the session has been interrupted. So you need to be prepared, either using a phone or FaceTime as as a backup. It's very important. Invest in good software, a camera, a high resolution camera, and basically a good internet speed. These are very important things I would suggest that helps in a client assessment.
So, Richa, what I'm hearing from you is much more around the setup and setting yourself up for success, more so than for you who's been doing this for many years. It's not so much for you about a difference in the experience for you as an assessor. It's much more about setting the consultation up for success beforehand and sending out documentation so that the examinee knows what to expect, and so that you are using good audio, good camera equipment, and that there are some really clear guidelines there around how you're going to conduct the consultation.
True, that's right. And give yourself about 15 minutes more than a normal medico-legal assessment. And that's very important to just have a test run, because if you're going to be short on time, then it's going to be very difficult in terms of conducting the assessment. So that's the advantages of doing a virtual assessment, especially in a psych setting, because you're actually seeing the client in their normal environment. Whereas as compared to face-to-face, always some of the responses are very exaggerated, and it can be quite difficult to assess a clear mental state examination. So I think the advantages over virtual consultations to face-to-face compared to face-to-face.
And that's a very interesting point that you've mentioned, Richa, because I know that we were talking about this over the last couple of days, that for you as a psychiatrist, and bear in mind we will move on and look at experiences of doctors who are more of a physical basis, a physical nature, but there are a lot of psychiatrists on the line tonight as well. From your experience, you actually find that seeing the person in their own environment, where they're not stressed, where they're not anxious, where you can see, you know, their kind of day-to-day context, is actually better for you, often in terms of trying to make an accurate determination, than when you've asked them to actually come to a foreign place. So you've actually found that you're able to get a better assessment in terms of understanding of the individual situation when it is being done in their own location.
I absolutely agree with that. Having done both face-to-face as well as virtual consultations, I find that the virtual consultations are better conducted, and you get a better quality of history because you're not containing the patient, being they being in the normal environment. And if they have access to a support person, which most of the times they do have, it makes the consultation very easy for a psychiatrist.
Okay, so let's have a chat about that as well, Richa. Do you ever feel that when the person is in their own environment, in their own home, which is now the new normal, or when they have a support person, do you ever have concerns about them being coached and that therefore changing your understanding of their situation?
I've not had such an experience so far. I'm sure people would differ in their views, different psychiatrists. Having experience, the more experience you're in psychiatry, if someone's coach, you're able to pick up through the length of an interview. The environment does not play a very important part in coaching a client. So I believe it does not change the outcome or the presentation of a patient, whether it's virtual or face-to-face. And that's been my experience over the years.
So it comes down to your clinical expertise, really, to pick up those kinds of cues in terms of if somebody's coached or not. It comes down to your own clinical expertise. I wanted to ask you as well, Richard, you have been doing it for a long time, and I know that there are many people now looking at you know, the legalities of doing these assessments via video conferencing, and we're certainly going to talk about that tonight as well, particularly when it comes to impairment assessments. Over your experience doing these, do you find any difference in the quality and outcomes of your assessment when they're conducted via video conference? And have you found that you have been challenged more on the reports that are undertaken via telehealth compared to those that have not been?
So far, I've never been challenged, and I have read through reports, and feedback from people who received the report have certainly stated that there has been no difference in the quality of the reports or reporting their mental state. So I believe it's just getting used to the process. That's really important. And there are times you pick up more signals through a virtual thing than face-to-face. And I find over time, as I said, with practice, you become quite an expert with that. The way I work is I use a laptop for typing my reports, and I have a desktop at the back with my Skype going, because that can be a challenge when you're doing a Skype or using any platform. How do you take down notes, and how do you take the information? This is the way I've been working for years, is I keep typing on my laptop as I'm seeing the patient, and I usually tell the client I would be doing that during the session, and that works quite well for me over the years.
And I think as well, Richard, that comes down to setting expectations, so that when you are not in the same environment as the person, you do need to communicate a lot more about what you're doing and why you're doing it. So for you, you found that typing the notes up during the consultation helps you, but obviously that context to explain what you're doing, that you're going to take some notes as you go through so that you're making sure that you're remembering things and noting things down accurately. So I think that's another key point, that, and thank you for raising that, just about providing context with what you're doing, but also thinking about your context and how are you going to take the notes? How are you going to manage this? Because when you are in a remote situation, if you've got your head down all the time and they're seeing the top of your head, it is going to have an impact on the quality of the information that you are receiving from the examinee. So thank you, Richard. We're going to have a look now. I'm going to have the next question now to Todd. And, you know, while many psychiatrists have been conducting medico-legal assessments to clients via video conferencing for years now in regional and rural settings, to the prison system, etc., it is completely new ground for many doctors who are of a physical-based specialty, like you, Todd, for example, as an orthopod. So it's really valuable, given that this is new ground for so many here on the webinar tonight, to share the wealth of ideas around how specific consultations could be done via video conferencing, noting that it is the start, noting that as time goes on, we're all going to get so, well, not we, you are all going to get so much better at this, and that you'll all start to develop a lot more examples amongst yourself about how to do different tests and different examinations so that you've got a level of confidence when you're providing your medico-legal opinion. So Todd, a question that has been submitted is how to conduct a valid comprehensive knee or foot examination through a video consultation. Given this is your expertise, we'd love to hear from you about some suggestions that you may have in terms of what you would have done when you were physically there with the injured person, compared to now how you would adapt your consultation via video conferencing.
Yes, thanks. So, with this new medium, you just have to think to yourself, how can I reproduce what we do face-to-face with what we do online? And in some ways, there are advantages, because if you get consent for taking images, for instance, you can have someone doing motion and taking snapshots. And that's one option that might be helpful, because as I was taught by Richard Seckel, and from what I understand, we have to show evidence about our opinions. We have to back up our opinions with what we have done. So I think that in that light, I've been thinking a lot about how to do, because a lot of our assessments require range of motion and looking at this. And while some of our assessments can be done with diagnostic estimates, sometimes you have to choose the one that's more relevant. And so range of motion might be the more relevant one. So I think, for instance, I'm going to stand here. As you're seeing me right now, you can only see my head. So I think you need an environment where someone can move back and they can stand a little bit further from the screen. And then you can watch them, for instance, if they're moving their elbow. We can make them move their maximal effort, take a snapshot. There are some software programs that you can use that are like digital goniometers on the screen, and they can measure angles on the screen. And I've asked a friend of mine who's a programmer to help me with this, to make my own, so that we can measure angles and show that we can measure the maximal effort of extension, flexion, and use those in impairment ratings. And who knows, in the future, this might be the more accurate way, because in face-to-face, when we read reports about goniometer measurements, we don't know how accurate they might be. There's no evidence of that. So this might be, moving forward, a more acceptable way of doing things.
And I know, Todd, when we were speaking as well, just over the last couple of days, you talked about, the golden rule being measured 3 times. And we also talked about the fact that often when you get a radiological report, you are relying on the radiographer to have gotten the position of the leg, for example, correct, but you don't actually know that there was a consistency there. So when we were talking about, if you were to apply an approach like you suggested, where you might get them to hold their elbow in a certain way or their leg in a certain way, and then you take a photograph and do a measurement, one of your comments was, it could actually be, quite an accurate way to do it, because I know how I've measured it, and I know the position has been correct according to my best judgment.
Yeah, so I mean, that's true. And along those lines, that's exactly what we've noticed when we've taken x-rays in the past, is that they can show differences, so they have to be standardized. And looking forward with this, there's probably some futuristic way of just standardizing the exam in a digital fashion. I mean, maybe someday we'll have a room set up already with the screen so that everything's set up for the client to walk in without a person there, and then everything's set up in a standardized way. It might be helpful. So
yeah. Yep, and I think, I think the situations that we have right now, we talk about opportunity coming out of adversity. And as you say, Todd, who knows, maybe in 6 or 12 months' time, we actually do have a digital means where we can be I guess, more accurate in terms of these measurements. Given that there are now some pretty strict rules around social isolation, I guess that the starting place is to say, what can we do? We are, you are asked for your best opinion possible. Everybody's in the same situation right now where, there is very little laying on of a hand. So what are some of the other things that you can do? So thank you for that, Todd. We're going to also hear from a number of the other physical-based specialists like Ralph and David again in a moment. So I'm just going to thank you, Todd, for joining us. Todd has to pop off.
Thank you.
I'm just going to cover off a couple of different questions now that have come in through the chat box as I dismiss Todd. Okay, now there's been a couple of questions that have come up. One is about correspondence in Victoria appearing to relate to therapeutic interventions and not independent assessments. As I say, certainly keep your eye on the websites for TAC and VWA for the most up-to-date information. And I know that they are releasing this all the time. I certainly know that I've spoken with VWA, and their approach at the moment for eligibilities is that they know that there are limitations. They know that there are both claimants and there are doctors who are not wanting to meet face-to-face, and so therefore the message is quite pragmatic, and it's about saying, do what you can do to give the best opinion possible, and where you can't comment, where you can't be confident, to make sure you make a note of the things that you can't comment on. So while we're still working through this and we're still transitioning, the message has very much been about, we're working through this, do what you can, and what you can't, let us know, and together we'll work through that. It could be that, outside of eligibilities, it could be that there are more supplementary reports that are done, for example, over the time. So I know that's been some feedback. Thank you for your question around Skype. We're going to cover that off a little bit later. And we're also going to talk about a question that's come up about many colleagues, Medico-Legal colleagues, worried about whether the reports will be accepted by the courts. Will the reports be accepted by the courts? And we're certainly going to cover this off as well. So thank you for the question. Please keep them coming. We are keeping track of these all the time. All right, now, so Greg, I'm going to call on you. Greg, you as an IMC have been doing a lot of consultations as well via video conferencing, and I know personally you're very tech savvy and very, very familiar. You've also been doing some assessments via video conferencing, and I would have to say Greg's probably one of the most tech savvy doctors that I know of. So given that you've been conducting a lot of medico-legals via video conferencing, are there some tips that you could provide the participants here about managing the physical environment? So I call them success tips, how to make the best out of doing a video consultation as far as the setup goes. Oh, hang on a second, Greg, sorry. Just a moment. Okay, Greg, could you unmute your microphone, please?
Sure. Okay, yep, no problems. Yeah, with the physical environment, there's a few things. Rich has touched on a few of them already, but certainly the camera, making sure the camera's in the right position so it's not looking up your nose or you're only seeing the top of their head. I think the lighting is very important. You don't want to be too dark, you don't want to be too bright, you don't want to have a window behind you with the sun blaring in so you can't be seen. So, and it varies from the time of the day as well. So obviously I'm doing assessments during the day with the sun coming in the window. It's completely different now that it's dark. So you have to take all those into account. What you're wearing, so try and have something not too busy, I usually wear fairly plain shirts when I'm there, because you don't want the camera being, freaked out with what you're wearing. Noise, as it was talked about before. So if you've got a dog, if you've got children, if you've got car noises, they're all very important. Richard talked about getting the software that you are happy with. I try and have 2 or 3, because you never know. You've got to be a bit nimble sometimes, because one, especially these days, there's so much traffic. CoView might crash, Zoom might crash, so you've got to have a backup. So I would have 2 or 3 that you are happy with, and yeah, I agree with Richard. Test it, test it, test it. Test it out with one of your kids. If you've got a teenager or a millennial, they know this stuff way better than we're ever going to know it. And I would also do a trial run and record it and then watch it back, so you can actually see what you look like, because it's what you think you look like and what you look like are 2 completely different things.
How true is that, Greg? I do a lot of training and do have to record myself, and I often have some cringeworthy moments when I see my common mannerisms. So that's a good point, Greg. Recording yourself, you certainly can see yourself and see all the different things that you do well and the things that you don't do well. Okay, thank you for that, Greg. We're going to come back to you a little bit later as well. Now, David and Ralph, assessing a psych injury is quite different to assessing a physical injury, and I'm going to throw firstly to Ralph. How have you found the transition, Ralph, and what general advice would you give to others who are now starting or embarking on this journey?
Yeah, I've found the transition a little difficult in a sense, because it's so different from what I'm used to doing. But having done a few now, I think the most important thing at the start is really to establish a good rapport with the patient. It's what I normally do anyway, but it's far more important in this context than when you're in your office. You've really got to make sure that you get along well with the patient, that the patient's happy. Ask them some general questions about how they are, where they are, whether they've got comfortable in their room, whereabouts they are, that type of thing. And just about the general life, how they're coping with the coronavirus thing. I think a little bit of chat like that at the start is going to be very helpful, because if you establish satisfactory rapport, then when you need to get people to move, to visualize their joints and so on better, they're going to cooperate with you. So I think that's really, that's important in any medico-legal consultation, but it's vital in this sort of circumstance. The other thing is, I think you've got to be able to think laterally. I've been repairing British cars for about 30 years, so I'm very good at this. But you've got to think of doing things in a different way and use your eyes as much as you can. As I think Todd mentioned, if you can, you've got to try and get the person to move the camera back a little and get them to walk so you can observe the gait. One thing I noticed recently, though, was if you click your mouse on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen and drag it across to your right, your screen width increases dramatically. And you can really get a good view of people's gait. You've got to do things like getting the stand on the leg, on the tiptoes, squatting, all that kind of stuff, but you can do all that quite easily. Measuring joint movements is quite difficult, I think, because you've got to get the camera positioned properly. And so if you're using a laptop or an iPhone, it's much easier that way because it can be adjusted. I did an assessment for a company where the camera was situated in the boardroom. It's a private room, but the camera was mounted high up on the wall and the microphone was in the middle of the boardroom table. So you had a choice of either seeing the person or hearing them, and you had to sort of get them to move to accommodate that. But again, if you establish a good rapport, people will accommodate what your needs are. I think there are various little tips that you can use, like for instance, somebody with carpal tunnel syndrome, you obviously can't do a Tinnell sign, but you can do the Phalens, you can do the reverse Phalens, and as David mentioned the previous time, you can get them to self-palpate, and I think that's a really good way of doing it. I'm not sure about the goniometer app, probably because I haven't used it. But if you think about impairment assessments, I do a lot of spine impairments and that kind of thing. They're nearly all DRE anyhow. And so you don't need to really measure things. I think really you've just got to be creative, think outside of your normal pattern. And that's what Richard's comment is, of practicing on everybody you can find.
For sure. And what I've also heard as well, you've talked a lot about lateral thinking, you've talked about equipment. There's that whole element of thinking in advance, isn't there, about, okay, what am I going to assess coming up tomorrow, for example, or in 2 days' time? What is the nature of the injury? And as Richa also mentioned, she sends out communication to her examinees ahead of time to help prepare them. I consider the scenario that you had where your examinee was in a boardroom and it was a fixed TV and a fixed camera, and it was much more difficult to examine the lower part of the leg. So considering what's coming up, and I know David's going to have a chat about this as well, but considering what's coming up over the coming days for your examinations is also about setting some guidelines for those people about what you need. So if it is space that you need to let them know about being in a location or finding a room in their house where they've got adequate room to stand and walk so that you can observe that. If it's around, technology, is it a laptop that you need? Is it an iPad? Is it a phone? And, these are all conversations that we never would have had 3 weeks ago. Like, never. We would have always discussed, face-to-face. We would have always spoken about desktop computers. But given that this is probably going to be the new normal for at least the next 6 months, and I heard some comment as well about, remaining socially isolated until a vaccine has been created. For goodness sake, we don't know how long this could go on for. But it is about, as the medico-legal expert, really considering your tools and looking at what do I need in terms of recommendations to the examinee that I can help to make it a better assessment. We also fully acknowledge that the examinee may not have that equipment, but it is about saying, well, look, if you do, and if you have this available, this would help the examination, rather than starting the examination and really saying, oh, well, if you'd had an iPad, that would have helped. Oh, I do have an iPad, oh, let me get it now, and you've wasted 15 minutes, all of those kinds of things. So we're going to talk a little bit later. I know there's questions around impairment. We are certainly going to talk about those. We're also certainly going to talk about security and differences between platforms. So I just want to assure all of our participants that we are going to talk about those as well. Before we move on to looking at the impairment, though, I would like to also hear from David, because he has done quite a lot of physical assessments over the last 3 weeks. He's had a whole range of different experiences. So a couple of questions for you, David, starting with, firstly, how have you found the transition? Secondly, what are some of the things that you are now engaging in a virtual consultation in terms of examination techniques that that you're having to do now that are different to conducting a face-to-face? We'd love you to share some tips about things that you're doing. Firstly, the transition.
The transitions, the problem with the transition is the technical part. Today I did 3 consultations on an iPhone. I rang the patients up last night, last night, asked them, have you got a computer? No. How would you like to carry out the consultation? And they were happy to advise what they were familiar with: WhatsApp, iPhone, FaceTime, and they were happy to direct me about how they wanted to do things. So I've got more tools in my kit bag than they have usually, and so I can, by talking to them, arrange what to do, and they're very comfortable with that. And they seem to be more comfortable sitting at home than they do coming into town, walking into some strange place and sitting in the consulting room. It's less intimidating, and I find it a pretty intimate sort of relationship you have with your patient over the telehealth platform. So that's good. They seem to be pretty relaxed very quickly. And as Ralph said, you make them relax. But the examination is interesting, particularly some aspects. For example, examining a hip joint is quite interesting. It's not as good as doing it live, but you can get many things done. And I do it by demonstrating exactly what I want them to do. Like Todd showed before, if I want to show a shoulder examination, I'll get them to put their shoulder in the middle of the screen and I'll show them what I want to do in mirror image. Lift your arm up. When does it get painful? And they lift it up. Now, it's like teaching a first-year student how to examine the shoulder. And I've found that most of them pick it up pretty well. In fact, one of them today, I said, I think you could come and work in our practice as a shoulder examiner now. They were tremendous. They did resistant movements. Put your arm out in front of you, put your hand on top of it. I want you to push up. And they would push up, did exactly what I wanted, turn to the side, show them what I'm doing. Where does it hurt? And they could say, is it strong? I've done about 15 shoulder examinations in the last month. And I think every one of them has cooperated totally with the examination, and it's been tremendous. They've palpated, they've shown resisted movements, ranges of movements. They can show, we're going reverse here, lateral rotation. Now I ask them to turn around and show me how far they're going. And it really is very good. And even palpation, as we were saying. Okay, so what's it feel like here? Now, we know how patients can overreact to things. Again, I haven't found anyone overreacting really, and they're not going, oh, they're showing, yeah, it hurts here. Show me where it hurts. They're not frightened of me examining them. Also, because many times when I examine people, I push them a bit and take them beyond where they might want to go. So they're less frightened also. So it's all useful stuff.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. And I think these kinds of examples are so valuable to keep sharing, you know, as medico-legal experts, as you transition now and start to do more of these things, how valuable it is to actually talk about these things as a peer group. There is a question that's come in on the question chat. I'm going to also, Ralph, unmute you again, but I'm going to direct it firstly to David and then at you, Ralph. And the comment was that range of motion of the spine is easy, but assessment of radiculopathy is a critical part of DRE spine assessment. How do you overcome this without underestimating impairment?
Well, I think oh, sorry.
Ralph, you go.
Okay. I think a simple way of assessing radiculopathy is to ask them precisely which part of the leg, for instance, or the arm their pain's going down in. If they point to the lateral part of the leg, it's S5, the back of the leg, it's S1. You can kind of work it out that way, and you can determine the extent of the radiculopathy by how far down the leg the pain goes, asking them various questions about numbness, pins and needles, color, temperature change, etc. You can get them to stand up and roll up their trouser legs or whatever, and have a look and see whether there's any obvious muscle wasting, but that's not that easy to do via camera. I think there are various non-examination means of doing these things. Obviously, you can't test reflexes, and you can test resistance movement, as David's pointed out, but that's not a very objective way of doing it. I think you've got to rely much more on the history here than on the examination findings. Straight leg raising is a bit of an issue because it depends on whether you can lie the person down. But as David was saying last time, you can sometimes try and lie them down and get them to do the straight leg raising. Otherwise, you can get them to sit in a chair and extend the knee to see, you know, which is what we sometimes do to double check things. So I don't see that as a big problem because you got to bear in mind what you're actually looking for. If you got a condition which would be better assessed by DRE than range of movement, then you can, by taking a very detailed history, get a fairly clear idea of whether there's radiculopathy or not.
Mm-hmm. David, do you have anything to add to that, David? No?
Well, from a semantic point of view, radiculopathy means nerve root involvement. Radicular pain means radicular pain. So if they've got radicular pain, which in the leg is sharp shooting pain concentrating distally, then they've got radicular pain. Radiculopathy, very difficult to assess. Now, the other day I asked a patient, has any doctor done your reflexes? And I found over my time that most of the time no one's done any reflexes, but this time someone had done the reflex and said my ankle jerk wasn't working. Now sometimes I can do an ankle jerk and find it when the others couldn't with reinforcement. So that's information. Walk on your, for gross abnormalities, walk on your tiptoes, walk on your heels, L5S1. And you can do some other resisted movements. It's easier in the arm to get them to test and show you what's weak. And you can ask them to map out their numbness, because numbness gives you some idea of it. But it is not easy and it is not accurate.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, David. And so that raises a very important point, and we've had a question as well that's along these lines, and it's certainly not the first question that we've had submitted leading up to this webinar or on the webinar that we ran on Monday night as well. And the question is absolutely around impairment. I'm going to direct this to Karena, but just as an example of a question that's come in, DRE is mentioned, how can you really check for radiculopathy? Sorry, I got tongue-tied. Radiculopathy. It's very easy to dispute any assessment without a trained assessor with them, and I would say all spinal assessments for whole person impairment could be disputed. And now this is, like I say, there have been many questions like this around disputes and how can you really do whole person impairments without actually being there, without having accurate measurements. And I think the question is, you know, is Medico-Legal, as a medical practitioner, you can do what you can, but without the laying of hands, there is a much higher level of grey area there. So how do the courts deal with this from a legal perspective? What's your view on this, please, Karena? We'd all love to know, and there's probably going to be 100 questions that come from this.
Yeah, so I think that the issue is more so that we need to just reflect on where we've come. So we've always had disputing opinions. It's never been the situation where just because in this instance for me, I'm a plaintiff solicitor. So in terms of the insurer may have examined my client, and I also have had my client examined, and they are competing opinions. So the issue with that is that even though they've both been physically examined, we already have a playing field of competing opinions. So now we move into the situation that we're in, which will be, again, in my view, a even playing field, because not only will my doctors or the doctors that I send my client to be doing it via telehealth or some other means, so will the insurer. So it will be very even playing field in terms of neither of them will actually be doing a physical examination, and we'll need to adapt and be creative, as the doctors on the panel have said, to accommodate, to be able to give their opinions. Now, it's all about their opinions and how they get to that. That is the context of what the court looks at. What is the doctor's opinion and how did they get to that compared to the doctor that is in the competing opinion? So we really haven't moved that far away from what we're currently doing. It's just the examination process will be slightly different.
So what I'm hearing from you, Karena, is that it's very much a level playing field. We all acknowledge that we don't have the accuracy at our disposal as we may have had before. We are saying, though, that for many of the examinations we're asked to do, that there are a lot of things you can do. Impairments are certainly a little bit trickier. However, when it comes to a dispute scenario, both parties are actually under the same level of challenge and still have the same kind of handicap as each other have, essentially. So from a court's perspective, it is a little bit like, well, it is about, and you've mentioned this before, the goal is always to support your argument, to say what your opinion is and your rationale to get there. So in the absence of the actual laying of hands, there are still things you can do to come to your opinion. And the key here is to say, look, I would normally conduct A, B, and C. Given the current circumstances, the way I came to my opinion is 1, 2, and 3. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So the more substance you can put behind your opinion, the better, and how you got there, because there's always be criticism as to the medico-legal opinions. That's just the way, unfortunately, it is. Occasionally we get some type of agreement on some issues and not on others, and sometimes we get agreement across the board. So no matter what, I think as long as you're doing what you do best is examining the client in terms of the virtual way and showing, you know, how you got your measurements, whether it's photos or whether it's, as David showed, demonstrating the activity that you're asking your patient or client to do, then you can back up the opinion.
Okay, and I know that previously as well, you've made the point about there's probably now more an increased focus on answering the key questions as well.
Yes, so I think what we need to focus on is that things are changing, and we do need to look at it differently. And in my view, I think that solicitors in particular, or insurance companies, claims managers, are going to have to really think about the types of questions that they're now going to be asking the medico-legal doctors. And then if they need to, having a discussion with them as to the best type of question, given the type of evidence they need to get in order to answer it.
So do you think that there'll be an increased number, or do you think there'll be a flurry of examinations now that don't stand up in court? What impact do you think this will really have, given that both sides are in the same situation? What's your
I wish I had a crystal ball. I suspect that during this period, and the issue really is we don't know how long this is going to go on for, that there'll be a grace period in terms of, well, during this time we had to do the examinations virtually. And then if, for instance, those matters do resolve, fantastic. If they don't resolve and we still, 18 months down the track and there is a possibility of now a physical examination, then we would just move to a supplementary report if those issues are still an issue. But that is the case anyway. Again, we still have that. So even when I serve a report and the insurer serves a report back to me, I may still need to get a supplementary report because I am not a doctor and I'm not qualified under AMA 4 or 5. I don't have those qualifications. Yes, I've been doing this for many years, and I know a lot of people would like to claim they know how to work out the WPI or any other component of it. But at the end of the day, that's not going to stand up. You're going to need the medico-legal doctor to provide that evidence.
Okay, and I think what we're saying here is that it's a very difficult area, and I'm certainly looking at a lot of the questions and comments that are coming through. Certainly I think that a lot of the examinations around causation and liability can continue. Impairment, I guess, is going to be, there are some things that you can determine confidently an impairment level on, and there are some things that can't be. And I know that we're all seeking a lot more clarity, and it's coming through now from the regulators about what things are appropriate to do an impairment on and what things are not. I think the other thing that I'm hearing is that, this is such early days, and a lot of conversation still needs to happen moving forward from here about how we proceed. At the moment, what we do know is that these requests for assessments are still coming through, giving, and particularly for impairment assessments as well, and given that they are still coming through, it is about, well, there are limitations, but what can you do to mitigate it until further notice? We do need to keep the assessments coming through, so what can we do? I guess the question is also, Karena, what if you really feel that you can't provide an opinion around impairment level?
Yeah, and I think that medico-legal doctors need to appreciate what they can and can't commit to, and we'd never want to put them in a situation where they're not committed to their opinion, because that would not be good for anybody. my suggestion is as they're doing through CIRA and the Workers' Compensation Commission in New South Wales, they have suggested that the examinations are to take place. However, they appreciate that in some circumstances it would not be possible, and therefore they would go into a medical pending list. And then when the opportunity for a face-to-face is available, then they would work through that list in terms of having them examined. And that will be the same for AMS disputes. So any disputes that need to go off to an approved medical specialist, or any disputes in relation to MAS, they will also be put into a medical pending list if they can't be dealt with.
Yeah, okay. So I think I guess the message is that at the moment it's still a work in progress. We're all still trying to work through this, and we'll get clearer direction over time from the regulators about how to move forward. In the meantime, if there are assessments that you can't do, then that's what it is. You know, you can't do it. And I think the point here is around communication, that as the medico-legal expert, if you feel that you cannot conduct the assessment, then you need to go back and say for now that that's one of the assessments that can't be done. And no doubt the regulators are gathering this kind of information and will get clearer understanding about feedback from medico-legal experts about the kinds of injuries and examinations that can and can't be done. I've got another really tricky question for you, Karena, but it's a fantastic question, and it's around this issue around level playing field and the fact that some medico-legal experts won't do telehealth and some will. Do you think that from a legal perspective, will this create some imbalance if it's challenged? The fact that some have conducted via video conferencing and some have not?
I think that at this point in time, with the social distancing and what's been recommended by the government and New South Wales, you need to get on board. So if you're not on board in terms of doing the telehealth, then maybe medico-legal reports directed at you shouldn't be continued to be directed at you, because we're going to have a knock-on effect from this in terms of, well, the directions from courts and tribunals are, and barrister colleagues of mine are saying, look, you know, we need to continue to progress this. It's an injustice to those injured if we don't, because if there's a delay in their claims, that can affect their ongoing weekly compensation payments, it can affect their ongoing treatment. There's a whole array of things that would happen, and we don't want to be putting workers in that position, or injured people, if we don't have to. So my view is that there, in some situations, it definitely, we cannot do the assessments. But from what I'm hearing from the panel is that they're being very creative and adaptive, and that is actually what's been filtered down from courts and tribunals to assist and make sure claims are still progressing.
Okay, so I guess the take-home message here is that for now, you need to keep going. You do what you can do. If there are any that you can't do, then you know you're the medico-legal expert. You're totally within your grounds to say that that's something you're not able to do. But I think it's very much got to be now around you know, some good conversation between the regulators and also between the lawyers, as we're all starting to work out what can and can't be done. I have one more final question for you, Karena, and to our participant who's entered the question, I do apologise if I've slightly got this wrong, but the comment here was around in a country called in Victoria that one of the reports was criticised. Sorry, I'm just trying to find it here. Okay, it was critical of a psychological report. I'm assuming that was done via telehealth. I'm just wondering what your experience has been with some of the psychiatric or psychological assessments that have been conducted via telehealth. Have you heard much about pushback around that, or are they, you know, what's your perspective?
Previously, there was a lot of pushback in relation to telehealth psychological and psychiatric assessments. I think that it's an opportunity for either party to criticise, and an easy hit of the report to simply say, well, how do you know that? Because you haven't actually physically examined the patient. But I think now that we're in the times that we're in, that will switch slightly, and there'll be less criticisms, because I myself would be referring my clients through telehealth, and also it would be difficult for me to then criticise someone else's report if my report is also virtually prepared. So I think we're going to move away from that, and there'll be interesting times ahead as to whether or not more and more reports are done by telehealth or virtually, because it does assist, as Dr. Isha said, was in terms of they're in their own controlled environment, and in the world of psychology, that is a massive component. Most clients will call me a week out and have such severe anxiety about going to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist. And the fact that now it will be done through virtual should take away some of that anxiety.
Okay, just a final comment and a comment that's in the question box, which has been, well, if I see somebody via telehealth and then somebody else sees the individual face-to-face when it's over, is it still a level playing field? And I can probably speak for you, Karena, correct me if I'm wrong, to say, well, look, I think there's no answer to that right now. It probably is not a level playing field. If one is the situations will change, and depending on the nature of the injury, I think telehealth for psychiatric is certainly not being just, is certainly a good practice now and is well accepted. Maybe for some other injuries in time, once this is over, we'll see what happens, and if at that time the person needs to be reassessed or, some other.
I think what we need to consider is that we won't be in this forever. There will be a time when we will go back and do things differently. But on a side note, this is a great opportunity for those who are in remote areas that actually can't get to see medico-legal doctors or find it very challenging. I had a client that needed to travel 6 hours to get to an insurer's medico-legal assessment, and by the time she got there, she could barely walk. So the assessment is skewed because it's affected by that travel time. My view is that if you are doing a telehealth at the moment and someone else has done a face-to-face, yes, there will be a possibility for criticism, but there was anyway. We generally, unless we agree on the points and issues throughout the report, there will be a dispute no matter what. That's why we're currently in litigation. Otherwise, the insurer would have just paid out the entitlement. So generally, we're not getting medico-legals unless we're in dispute, except for the AMA assessments. But there's no reason why you couldn't then put that on hold or possibly look at a supplementary.
Okay. All right. Look, thank you, Karena. We spent quite a bit of time looking at the legal aspects, and I did want to mention right now, Karena has made herself available. If any of you have any questions that you'd just love to get her opinion on after this, for any aspects medico-legal, she's more than happy for you to give her a phone call or an email, and we'll certainly give you those details. I think it's going to be interesting days ahead. There's a lot of things that we're still working out, and I think some of these questions coming through, I guess we'll see. We'll see what happens over time. But for now, the message is, social isolation. We still need to keep the assessments coming. Please do what you can, and what you can't, you do need to comment on. And that also applies to commenting on the way that you've done the assessment, that it has been undertaken via video conferencing. So, look, thank you for that, Karena. I just want to touch on a couple of questions as well that have come up in the question box here. We've had a question about for David and Ralph about what location they've been in. Have they been in their own home, and has the injured individual also come to their home? And the answer to that is no, they haven't. You've had the injured individual in the examinee's home, and the doctor has been in their own location. Let's have a look. What other questions have we got? We're going to talk a lot about the technology in a minute. We've talked a lot about, you know, whether things are easily disputed or not, and spent quite a bit of time on that. And I think, you know, we'll see how that goes. But for now, you know, we've mentioned that we need to keep going. Actually, one last question, I guess, for you, Karena, if you're still there. Do you know of any situations, sorry if your microphone is still on, do you know of any situations where telehealth would be unsuitable in the courts?
Oh, good question. No, I don't think so. I think that in terms of personal injury, as long as you can give that opinion and back that opinion up by whether it's physical or psychiatric. No, I think that it's possible for all claims unless there's some reason why you can't get the backing for your opinion.
Okay. All right. So thank you for that. I'm next going to ask a question again back to David. And back to Ralph again. Questions that have come up prior to these prior questions submitted prior. And this one is around what is your view, firstly to David, what is your view on engaging an injured person's family member or colleague to help you conduct a physical examination? And in what instances do you think that would be useful?
I think it's very useful to engage a family member if they're available. They can hold the camera. So if we're using an iPhone, for example, to film something, they can hold it. They can also assist in the examination and you can ask them to do resistant movements. So they're very useful. They're also nice backup for the patient, and no one's intruded in my consultation at this stage. So having people around is good. I haven't used any assistance in my when I've been sitting at home doing my work.
Okay, great. Thank you, David. I'm going to leave you unmuted, David, for the next question. But Ralph, could you comment on that, please, as well? What are your views on having somebody in the consult assisting, given that you're now located virtually?
Yeah, I think that's quite difficult. It's a bit of a double-edged sword because the person who's assisting obviously has no concept of what you really want them to do. So in fact, you're having to instruct two people rather than one. I would really prefer just to use the patient alone. It's very difficult though. I think David pointed out, you can get the person assisting to hold the camera, and that I think is a real advantage. Sometimes it just gets unnecessarily complicated. I haven't had that circumstance of using a person assisting yet. And I think it's worth trying, because if there's somebody there who wants to assist, well, you can't tell them to go away. But I think you've got to take that bit by bit and not put too much emphasis on the person assisting. I think also from a legal point of view, with my limited knowledge of the law, I think you're treading water a bit there, because how would the court view somebody else who's non-medical and non-professional assisting you in doing the examination? Do you have a comment on that, Karena?
Oh, hang on, Karena. I'm sorry. I need to unmute you. One moment. Sorry, everyone. Okay, Karena, you're on.
Yeah, so I agree with you, Ralph, in terms of the difficulties. I think if they're just holding the camera to assist the process in terms of, you know, if the person's trying to move their up and down and they're trying to film it at the same time, might be quite challenging. So I think that would be okay, but I don't know whether or not there'd be an issue in terms of if they were actually putting any resistance or anything, providing that sort of how much do you know is resisting. You'd be better off to use a wall or something that's of a structure where you know the makeup of it rather than a person. But in terms of right now, I think we've got to continue to go back to doing the best we can with what we have. and thinking about that. So in terms of each of your practices, what works for each of you. And I know, Sue, you might talk about this later, but we talked about having a support forum in terms of, you know, in your specialties, you might have a few people that you can bounce off what they're doing and see whether or not that's something that might assist you. Because the more brains, the better, I say, and we should be trying to work out a standardized assessment process as best we can across the board while we are currently doing it this way.
Yeah, I think the other thing too you got to remember with doing these assessments, going back to first principles, is what you're looking for really is consistency, isn't it? Consistency between the history, what examination you can do, the radiology results, and basically the way the person presents to you. If there's a consistency there, well, that helps you a great deal. And I don't know that doing all sorts of tricks in doing the examination is going to improve your degree of understanding of the consistency. But what are your thoughts?
Yes, I agree with that. So I think the consistency is one of the number one. And you do that anyway in your practices in a physical sense. You would have a standard way that you conduct your consultations. It's now looking at that and preparing for it in a different way because it will be done via a video where you don't have the ability to have that hands-on direction.
Okay, thank you, Karena. We need to be moving on now. We've got still lots of questions and lots of questions around the technical aspects as well of getting prepared to do video conferencing assessments. One question though I did want to cover off, and that's a question around doing hybrid examinations. What if you can do testing, doing telehealth, but with some testing being done by patients at the clinic? And that's certainly something that's been discussed between David and myself over the time. And the answer is yes, you can, but you now need to really check in with your regulators. Certainly the information that I see, that my understanding of the information that I read from CIRA today was that they are really not wanting people to come into close contact, and they are preferring digital means. But that's my interpretation. The message here is please check with your regulators and get guidance from them about what you should now be doing. All right, so we are going to shift gears a little now. There's been a load of questions around security and tools, video conferencing tools that you can use. And one of the questions was around, is it okay to Zoom video conference? And what are the issues around security and privacy aspects of using video conferencing platforms and the choice of platform to use? So I wanted to touch personally with you on a couple of considerations around security, given that many of you are now working from home, and then I'll also talk about the choice of platform. So firstly, medico-legal telehealth assessments are considered a health service where information is collected and stored. So in the same way that the way you manage the injured person's medical documentation must meet the Australian Privacy Act requirements, so do your telehealth assessments. So this means that the law says you need to take all reasonable steps to protect the health information from misuse, from interference, loss, unauthorised access, modification or disclosure. And given the very many ways now that health information can be transformed and stored across digital means and the different services and products that are out there, it means that you need to take steps to protect that information. So when we're talking about that, we're not just talking about the video conferencing software that you use. It's also about thinking about how are you now going to receive your documentation and how are you going to store your documentation, particularly now that you're working from home. So for example, are you receiving your documentation via email or mail? And that could leave you quite highly exposed if something goes wrong. Are those documents being stored on your personal laptop where kids and partners can get access to that confidential information? Could it get stolen? So what are you doing about the medical personal information that you are receiving when you're doing these assessments? And considering are you using a digital secure platform is really important now. These are important because unfortunately some pretty big penalties may be applied for a breach. So up to $340,000 for you as individuals, up to $1.7 million for corporations if there are privacy and security breaches. So it is a big deal. We have listed a whole lot of information on privacy matters on the MEDirect telehealth page, and pretty much bringing together, culminating most of the things you need to know currently around privacy and security issues. And certainly the MEDirect platform meets all of those Australian privacy and security requirements for medico-legal doctors who receive their assessments that way. But because of this whole risk around breaches of privacy, even the RACGP is now recommending against using email and fax, and they are recommending using a secure digital platform. We saw that as well, the outcomes of the Royal Commission into misconduct, into banking, superannuation and financial services a couple of years ago. And for medico-legal experts, the way that has had repercussions is that now you must transact through a digital secure platform if you want to get work, medico-legal work, from banks, from life insurers and from government agents. You must now have a secure platform. So let's have a look now at video conferencing platform and see, well, what are the things you need to consider? Now, I just want to start by saying, to be clear, there is no single video conferencing platform that a medico-legal expert must use at this stage. Nobody is recommending that you use one, nobody is mandating, sorry, that's the right word. Nobody is mandating one video conference platform over another, and currently no one is dictating what you must use. The choice is completely up to you. However, security is the issue because, as we noted before, you know, there are some pretty big fines that may be applied for breaches. So when you are looking at what am I going to use, the key thing is to use a platform that ensures secure end-to-end encryption so that the video conference cannot be hacked, like it was for Zoom last week. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't use Zoom. I'm actually not recommending any platform over the other because, you know, even for Zoom last week, there were quite a number of instances of hacking. I know that as of Sunday, they put in place some more secure precautions, including password protection, so that people could not be part of a meeting if they were not invited. So things are changing all the time, which is why I don't really want to provide advice around which ones are secure and which ones are not. And I highly recommend you go onto the websites and you search for whether these software platforms are secure, if they have end-to-end secure encryption when you're making your decision. So that is the key thing, to make sure it is secure, but it's also around making sure it's a technology that you feel comfortable and capable of using. Like we said before, you don't want the technology to be getting in the way of your ability to effectively run your consultation. You want it to be something that's easy for you to use and easy for the other person at the other end to use, given that many of them are not tech savvy. So let me just give you a quick rundown of the options with video conferencing. Again, there is a lot of material on this on the MEDirect Telehealth webpage, and I can send out that link after this email as well. There's even a document comparing all of the top ones from Skype through to Zoom, through to GoToMeeting, WhatsApp, all of those kinds of things. And I certainly am not professing to be an expert on this, and I say do your own due diligence. In a nutshell, though, there are two kinds of platforms that are used. There is Skype, which requires a downloadable app, and then there are cloud-based systems. Now, the cloud-based systems all operate by, you have an account, which may be free or it may be a paid-for account, and you generate a secure link that is for one-time use that is then provided to the examinee. Now, the benefit of that kind of approach is that the link is only valid for that examination, and after that examination, after that time period, they cannot get back in again to your platform. They cannot you know, if you know, most people don't want examinees having their personal details and being able to access them at any time. So the cloud-based systems prevent that from happening. There's also CoView. I want to mention CoView. It's an Australian-based product that was created by the CSIRO, or they have a partnership with the CSIRO, and that's been created for doctors and is quite widely used right now. Like I say, I'm not advocating for any of them. I'm asking you to do your own due diligence for them. But the cloud-based ones are quite easy to use because you come in, you set the date that you want the meeting, you set the time, you generate a link and you get it to the injured individual. And all they have to do is click on the link so that the meeting pops up and you're in a secure environment at the other end. Now, Zoom is something where you have a downloadable app, and you have to download and keep it up to date, and so does the other end. And this can be one of the challenges. The other challenge can be that you have to exchange an address, and that means that if you are giving your personal address or Skype address, that the other person can contact you on that address at any time. I know that a lot of the colleges have in the past recommended Skype, I think, is an easy way to get started. It's also something that a lot of people have used in the past before. And I know that a lot of the practices, say the GP practices, have actually set up a GP account. Richa obviously uses it as well, and she's got a separate account, not obviously her personal account, so that she's not getting requests and she's not getting messages and phone calls on any of her personal addresses. So that is a couple of comments around the different kinds of platforms. Now, Skype, I do want to have a chat about security. Again, like I say, I'm not an expert. Please do your own research. My understanding of Skype is that there is a backdoor to Skype, so that when you've got a backdoor, it's more easily hackable. And I know that it has been in the press. I've done quite a lot of research on this myself to find out, is it a secure platform? Is it not a secure platform? The indications would say that while it is secure and encrypted, it still is hackable. And that's the same situation with Zoom. It is a secure encrypted platform, but still there were some glitches that happened. My message to you is keep up to date on this. Choose a platform that, to the best of your ability, will meet security and privacy considerations. Sorry, I just okay. I'm just so make sure that it meets security requirements and that it's something that you're comfortable using. Now, I think I might have mentioned something wrong a little bit before. Well, I just want to clarify. Zoom was hacked last week. I think that might have been the question that's coming through. I might have said Skype. I want to correct that. Zoom was hacked last week, and they've now put in place a higher level of security. So have a look on the website that we have and see what technology meets the security requirements that you're comfortable with, that you feel comfortable meet the requirements. And then second thing is to make sure the technology is not getting in the way of your ability to effectively run the consultation. So have a look at that. Please feel free to send in any questions around that. I do apologise if I've confused the situation a little bit. I'm happy to clarify that. I'd like to now just throw to Greg. Greg has done a lot of consultations via video conference, and I'd just like to speak to him or have him share with us his experiences of running video conferencing from the perspective of the recipient's end.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. I think you've covered a lot of it, and David mentioned things earlier. I think we have to remember that most of the people we have as patients, clients, or whatever, are very variable abilities, whether it's tech ability, English ability, intellectual ability, what sort of hardware, software they have in their own home. So, I mean, I've got patients who don't even know how to use email. So you have to be able to accommodate all those people. I personally use CoView as my main one, but like I said earlier, I think you need to be have a few up your sleeve, because some people say my computer's too old, I can't use CoView. Can you use Zoom? Okay, I'll use Zoom. Other people, like David was saying, they only have a phone, so you have to use Facebook or FaceTime or Skype. Sorry, FaceTime or WhatsApp. The downside of that is you've got to give someone your phone number. I don't know how all of you feel about that, but I have had to do some. Then I don't find them as good as using the cloud-based ones, but you've got to be nimble and you've got to do what you can do. I think testing it out the day before, whether it's you doing it, your receptionist, or getting a third party to do it. I know we've used a company called Telehealth Tech, who obviously for a fee will help you test that out, but that is vital because yeah, I've been caught out in the early days, and yeah, you test, as Risha was saying before. Yeah, so they would be my main points for yeah, dealing with the claimants.
Great. Okay, thank you for that, Greg. Now we're getting to the end of our webinar, and there's still a lot of questions. I just wanted to clarify that we will get back to each of you afterwards with any questions that we haven't been able to answer, and we're happy to put you in contact with any of the panelists if you would like us to provide some clarification. But I think the thing is here that, you know, there's been so many questions that have come through. There's been lots of comments, and very much this is early days. As we said, we're at the seedling stage right now, and you know, where we're going to be in 6 months' time is going to be very different to where we are now. There has been the suggestion made by others that you know, wouldn't it be great to be able to have some kind of forum where we could get together on some kind of regular basis to talk about, well, what are you doing? What's worked for you? How have you done this kind of assessment? Where do you think it does work? Where do you think it doesn't work? And that's the kind of forum that Karena mentioned that she's got with the solicitors as well, given it's so early, where they're actually talking about a whole range of these issues. And given the number of questions that I can see on my screen, I can see there's so many questions. So I wanted to launch a poll right now very quickly, and that is just to gauge your interest. If there was a forum to be created for medico-legal experts to discuss issues around conducting these assessments via video conferencing, would you be interested in being part of that? So I've just launched the poll now. If you could just press on the button with a yes or a no, that will give us an indication of whether this is something that you would like to do. Okay, we've got a lot of people already voting. We're about 75%. I'll close the poll in just a second. So if anyone has a final vote, please feel free to vote now. Okay. So let's have a look at the results of that. Pretty much 89% said that yes, they would like to join a forum, 11% no. That's very much the same as what we had as well on Monday night when we did this. So for me, that is saying a very clear yes, we would be keen to do this kind of thing and have a forum. Next question then is, how often would you like to meet? So please just take a moment to complete that as well. Fortnightly, monthly, or 6 weekly. All right, we're nearly getting to everybody voting right now, just a few final moments. Okay, so it's looking pretty clear that most of you would like to meet 6 weekly. So that's great. Thank you so much for your feedback. I very much appreciate that, and we will certainly pull something together where you can all just share the wealth of information while we're in this very busy and early stage. Okay, a few final things that I would love to tell you about. Actually, let me just have a quick look at questions. We've had an offer here, thank you, to prepare documents for patients in prepping for telehealth, an offer to share that documentation. Thank you very much. We would love to have that. So if you would please, Jeanette, if you would please mind sending that to me, I'm sure that everybody would benefit from that. We also have an information document about preparing for telehealth, and we're very happy to share that as well. It's a Word document. You can put your logo on it or not. I think the more resources that we have, the better. So thank you, Jeanette. Really appreciate that. We would love that. Okay, so a few final things. So initiatives to help you be on this webinar. So we've we'll work on a forum for sure. There are some resources on the MEDirect website. You see my, mugshot in 24 short video tutorials. Some of the things that we've talked about tonight are on these videos, some of them are not, so we cover a whole range of other different things. How the assessment's conducted, how do you receive telehealth appointments, for example. What are we talking about with telehealth? What are some standards, what are some success steps? I've mentioned security issues and so on. Here's the patient information resource that we have available, but we'll also have Jeanette's, and we'd love to share that. Thank you so much. I've got the URL just at the top of the screen of where you can find some of these resources. It's www.meddirect.com.au. The page is medical experts. The next page is transitioning to telehealth. We'll send that around afterwards as well. And of course, this video will be chopped and edited and made available to you also over the coming few days. Okay, now I'd just like to, I've got about 1 minute left, and I'd just like to throw again to our panelists. Let's start with, let's say David, followed by Ralph, followed by Richard. Actually, just about where do you see this all going over the next 6 months? And I'll ask Karena too. I think we've got a little bit of time. So, Ralph, next 6 months, a one-liner, where do you think we might be? Oh, hang on. That's David. I'll start with you, David.
Up the bush, doing telehealth and doing a few other things, but I don't think it's going to change much. I don't want to go near anyone much until they get a vaccine, because I've got cardiomyopathy and they won't resuscitate me, so I'm up here.
All right, so for you, certainly the health concerns are very real and you'd prefer not to see people face to face. Ralph?
I couldn't agree more. I think that's very likely this is what we're going to be doing in 6 months. We need to get up to speed with it pretty quickly. And I agree completely with David. It's very dangerous seeing patients face to face now. In fact, it's very dangerous going to the supermarket.
It's a very different world, isn't it? No one even wants to give eye contact anymore. Okay, so Greg, I'm going to ask you just some final comments. Where do you think we'll be in 6 months?
Doing a lot of telehealth. Yeah, I think it's and on the consultation side as well. I don't think it's just going to be confined to assessments. I think it's going to be talking to people like Karena as well, having conferences with lawyers rather than phone calls. So I think as people get more and more comfortable with using telehealth, I think we're going to use it a lot more.
Okay, thank you, Karena.
Yeah, I agree. I think we need to settle in for a little while. I don't think it's going to be anytime soon. And I would say that the predictions are that it will be longer than 6 months. And even at that point in time, there's still substantial risk. It's not just going to disappear. My concern is that if everybody doesn't get on board and start to learn the different ways, then many businesses won't actually survive, and that includes law firms. If they don't change their models and move forward with the times, then it could be a very different outcome.
Okay, thank you, Karena. And now probably Rich is the one who's most comfortable with this kind of medium. I'd love your thoughts on the next months.
I say as a psychiatrist, it's going to give me a life and work balance, more flexibility. And it's really good to see that the population is embracing technology all over. So that's amazing.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so just to wrap up here, I'd really like to thank all our panelists, to Greg, Todd, who was here for a little while, Karena, don't forget she's made the offer. If you've got any legal questions around Medico-Legal, to reach out. Ralph, Richard and David, thank you all for your time, and I will note that all of our panelists have given of their time freely tonight, on Monday night as well, and will no doubt continue to do so. So thank you so much for being involved. Thank you for sharing your insights. It is certainly, I guess, a new day. We're certainly in the midst of a whole range of working through a new way of doing things. So I'd like to thank you for your insights, and I'd like to welcome all of our participants to a forum that we will set up to share the wealth. I mention again, there have been a handful of questions, a lot of questions that we haven't been able to answer, and some fantastic ones like recording the assessment. Can you do that? Head on over to the the video tutorials that we've done. I mentioned quite a lot of detail around recording of consultations and whether that's kosher or not. And heads up, no, it's not. It's recommendations not to do that. But if you do, it talks around consent forms. We even have some comment there around telehealth consent forms and so on. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for giving your time. And thanks from me here representing the MEDirect team. We really appreciate you being on board tonight. Good night and have a great Easter.
Thanks, Sue. That's great.
Thank you so much, everyone.
You're welcome. Thank you.